The knights who gathered outside the town of Sudoměř on the 25th of March, 1420, were not worried. Chroniclers put their number at somewhere between 700 and 2,000 mounted men-at-arms, professional soldiers in plate armor, the so-called Iron Lords of Bohemia, and the enemy they had been sent to destroy was a column of roughly 400 peasants, farmers, millers, village craftsmen armed with threshing flails, the tool you use to beat grain out of wheat. The peasants were escorting women and children. They were exhausted from a forced march, and they had exactly 12 wagons. Not war machines, farm wagons, the kind you haul turnips in. Every military assumption of the 15th century said this fight would last minutes, and every military assumption of the 15th century was about to be proven wrong. Because standing on one of those wagons was a one-eyed man in his 60s named Jan Žižka. And over the next 14 years, this man and the system he built around the humble farm wagon would defeat 5 separate international crusades, humiliate the armored nobility of half of Europe, and never lose a single battle. Not one, even after he went completely blind. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how a wagon full of peasants beat the finest heavy cavalry on earth, the precise crew layout and weapon count inside a Hussite war wagon, the night a surrounded army punched through enemy lines in what some historians call the first armored breakthrough in European history, and the strange reason 2 words you know from modern warfare, pistol and howitzer, traced directly back to this peasant army. And there is one more thing. The wagon fortress was eventually beaten. Once. But it was not beaten by knights, and it was not beaten by crusaders. And when I tell you who finally cracked it near the end of this video, it will change how you see everything that came before. Here is exactly what this video will cover. First, the battle at Sudoměř itself, where those 400 peasants used a drained fish pond and 12 wagons to wreck an armored cavalry force several times their size, and the specific trick with the marsh that pulled knights out of their saddles. Second, the full anatomy of the Hussite war wagon, board by board, including the crew of roughly 16 to 20 men, the exact division of labor inside it, and how many gunpowder weapons a single wagon carried. Third, the 3 battles that broke 3 crusades, including one where an army that chroniclers numbered in the tens of thousands ran away before the fighting even started. Because of a sound. Fourth, the 5 specific reasons this system worked when everything about medieval warfare said it should not, including a written military code that was centuries ahead of its time. And fifth, the one battle where the wagon fortress finally failed in 1434. And the uncomfortable identity of the men who figured out how to beat it. A quick note on sources before we begin. Much of what we know comes from contemporary chroniclers like Lawrence of Březova, who wrote from the Hussite side, and from the records of the Crusaders themselves. Medieval numbers are always suspect, so wherever chronicle figures and modern estimates disagree, I will give you both. To understand Sudoměř, you have to understand what Bohemia looked like in the spring of 1420. 5 years earlier, a Czech priest and reformer named Jan Hus had been promised safe conduct to a church council in Constance, and then, safe conduct notwithstanding, burned at the stake as a heretic. His followers in Bohemia, who became known as Hussites, did not quietly disperse. They grew. By 1419, they were throwing royal officials out of windows in Prague, and by March of 1420, Pope Martin V had declared a formal crusade against them. The same legal and spiritual machinery that had once been aimed at Jerusalem now aimed at Czech peasants. Sigismund, King of Hungary and claimant to the Bohemian crown, began assembling an international army. And in the middle of this, a column of Hussite refugees left the town of Plzeň, heading south toward a hilltop settlement they were building called Tabor. Roughly 400 fighters, plus women and children, plus 12 wagons. Their commander was Jan Žižka, a man already around 60 years old, blind in one eye since youth, a minor nobleman who had spent decades as a professional soldier and, by some accounts, a mercenary and highway fighter. He knew exactly how knights fought. And on the road near Sudoměř, scouts brought him the news every medieval infantry commander dreaded: heavy cavalry closing fast on open ground. A footman in the open against a charging knight was, in the arithmetic of the era, simply dead. The knight had momentum, armor, reach, and a war horse trained to trample. Žižka could not outrun them. So he did something else. He looked at the terrain. Between two fish ponds near Sudoměř, one of them drained for the season, there was a narrow strip of land, and beyond it, the soft, sucking mud of the empty pond bed. Žižka pulled his 12 wagons onto that strip and chained them together, wheel to wheel, angled so that the ponds covered his flanks. The wagons became a wall. Behind and between them, he packed his crossbowmen, a handful of primitive gunpowder weapons, and his flail-armed farmers. The knights arrived in the late afternoon and saw exactly what they expected to see: a small, trapped rabble. And they did exactly what their entire training told them to do. They charged. And the charge failed. Horses will not impale themselves on a wall of wagons, so the momentum, the single greatest weapon of heavy cavalry, died at the wagon line. And suddenly, men in 60 pounds of plate were stationary targets at point-blank range for crossbow bolts and gunfire. Knights who tried to flank through the drained pond found their horses sinking to the knee in mud. And a later Czech tradition, impossible to verify but told for centuries, says Hussite women spread their veils and cloaks across the marsh so that dismounted knights caught their spurs and stumbled, where farmers with flails finished them on the ground. The fight lasted into dusk. As darkness fell, the Iron Lords pulled back, leaving the field, their dead, and their reputation in the pond mud. 400 peasants had stopped an armored force several times their size, at a cost the chronicles record as remarkably light. And here is why Sudoměř matters beyond Bohemia. It was not a lucky ambush. It was a proof of concept. Žižka walked away from that fish pond knowing he had found a machine that turned farmers into a fortress. And for the next 14 years, he and his successors would refine that machine into the most feared military system in Central Europe. So let us open the machine up and look inside, because the Hussite war wagon was not just a wagon parked sideways. In plain terms, it was a mobile fortress module, and the genius was in the details. Start with the vehicle itself. The Hussites took the heavy four-wheeled farm wagon common in Bohemia and modified it. Thick planks were added along one side, sometimes hinged so they could be dropped for firing or raised for protection, with loopholes cut for weapons. A second board could be hung low, covering the gap beneath the wagon between the wheels so no one could crawl under. Some wagons carried a ramp for loading and an extra reinforced wall facing the enemy. Chains and hooks were fitted at each end because in battle the wagons were locked together, wheel to wheel, into a continuous wall the Czechs called the Vozova Hradba, the wagon wall, which German enemies called the Wagenburg, the wagon fortress. Now the crew, and this is where the system stops being a barricade and becomes an army. Period ordinances and later reconstructions put the crew of a single war wagon at roughly 16 to 20 men, and every man had a defined job. Around 4 to 8 were crossbowmen. 2 or more were handgunners, carrying early gunpowder weapons. There were men with long hooked pikes, whose specific job was to drag riders off their horses. There were flailmen, farmers whose grain flails had been rebuilt with iron heads and spikes, a weapon with terrifying reach and impact against a man on the ground. There were pavis carriers, holding large shields to plug gaps, plus drivers and 2 men designated to handle the chaining and unchaining of the wagon line. 16 to 20 men, 1 wagon, and a Hussite field army might march with dozens or hundreds of them. Then there were the guns, and here the Hussites were not just early adopters, they were arguably the first army in Europe to make gunpowder weapons a standard, organized battlefield arm rather than a siege novelty. The small handheld gun the Hussites carried was called in Czech a pištala, which literally means pipe or whistle, and many linguists trace the modern word pistol directly back to it. The larger gun they mounted on wagons or carts, a short-barreled piece firing at groups of men, was called a hufnice, from the Czech word for crowd, and that word marched west through German and became howitzer. 2 of the most common words in modern artillery and small arms are, by the most widely accepted etymologies, Czech peasant words from the 1420s. That, by the way, closes the loop I opened at the start, but it also tells you something deeper. In battle, the system worked in phases. Phase 1, the approach, where the wagon column moved in parallel files, trained to wheel into a defensive formation on command. On ground, the commander had chosen in advance, ideally a slope or a spot with covered flanks. Phase 2, the fortress. Wagons chained, gaps plugged with pavises and dug earth, guns loaded. Phase 3, the storm, where the enemy attacked and was bled at the wagon line by crossbow and gunfire, unable to bring lance or momentum to bear. And Phase 4, the one everyone forgets, the counterattack. When the attackers were exhausted, disordered, and tangled in their own dead, the wagon wall opened, and Hussite cavalry and flail infantry poured out to break them. The Wagenburg was never just a shield. It was a trap with a door, and Žižka decided when the door opened. Which is exactly what the knights at Sudoměř never understood. They thought they had cornered a rabble behind some carts. They had actually walked into a weapon. Now, watch the weapons scale up, because Sudoměř was 12 wagons and 400 people, and what came next was crusade after crusade. The first great test came just 4 months later, in July 1420, at a hill called Vítkov on the edge of Prague. Sigismund had arrived with the full crusading army, a force Lawrence of Březova and other chroniclers inflated to 80,000 or even more, and which modern historians tend to place closer to 30,000, still an enormous host by the standards of the age. Prague's lifeline to the countryside ran past Vítkov Hill, and on that hill, Žižka had built a small fortification, wooden bulwarks, a ditch, walls of stone and clay, defended by a garrison the chronicles describe as a few dozen fighters, famously including women who refused to leave the works. On the 14th of July, Sigismund's heavy cavalry attacked the hill, and for a while it worked. They took a tower. They pressed the tiny garrison to the edge. Then Žižka arrived with reinforcements. A Hussite counterattack came up the vineyard slopes on the Crusaders' flank, and the knights on the narrow hilltop discovered the same lesson as the Iron Lords at Sudoměř, that armor and horses are worth very little when the ground takes away your momentum. The cavalry broke, Some riders were driven down the steep slope, and the assault collapsed. The numbers engaged were small. The consequences were not. Sigismund's coalition army, too large to feed and now humiliated in front of the city it came to conquer, dissolved within weeks, and the first crusade against the Hussites was over. The hill is called Vítkov today, and the largest equestrian statue in the Czech Republic, one of the largest in the world, stands on it. A blind man on a horse. The second example is the one military historians keep coming back to. Kutná Hora, December 14, 21. Sigismund invaded again, this time with a professional corps under the Italian condottiere Pippo Spano, and near the silver mining city of Kutná Hora, Žižka's field army was caught in the open and enveloped. The city itself rose behind him, its gates open to the royalists, and by nightfall on the 21st of December, the Hussite army was surrounded, cut off from food, water, and retreat. Encircled medieval armies died. That was the rule. Instead, in the darkness of that night, Žižka formed his wagons into a column, put his guns forward, and rolled straight at a chosen point in Sigismund's line, firing as the column moved. The wagons advanced, the guns blasted the gap wider, and the whole army passed through the breach and out into the winter night, largely intact. A number of historians have described it as something close to the first armored breakthrough in European history, a mobile gunpowder formation punching through an encirclement almost 500 years before the tank. And Žižka was not finished. Days later, in early January, reinforced and resupplied, he turned around and attacked the pursuing royal army, broke it at Habry, and chased it to the town of Německý Brod, where the rout became a massacre on the ice of the Sázava River. Within 2 weeks, the surrounded army had become the pursuing army, and Sigismund's second great invasion was gone. The third example needs almost no fighting at all, which is precisely the point. By 1431, Žižka was dead, carried off by plague in 1424 at the siege of Přibyslav, undefeated to the end. His successor was a priest, Prokop the Great, and under Prokop, the Hussite field armies had become so confident that they were raiding deep into Germany. So the church assembled a fifth crusade led by Cardinal Giuliano Cesarini, an army the chronicles again counted in the tens of thousands, with thousands of war wagons of its own, because by now everyone was copying the Czechs. On the 14th of August, 1431, near the town of Domažlice, this crusading army heard two things approaching: the rumble of the Hussite wagon columns and the singing. Tens of thousands of voices in the Hussite war hymn Ktož sú Boží bojovníci, ye who are warriors of God, a hymn every soldier in Central Europe had learned to associate with catastrophe. And the Crusader army, according to accounts from both sides, simply came apart. Units began pulling out before contact, the withdrawal became a panic, and the panic became a rout, with the Hussites capturing the baggage, the wagons, the guns, and, in the version told ever after with great Czech satisfaction, the cardinal's own hat, cross, and robes abandoned in his flight. An army had been defeated by a sound, because the sound carried 11 years of unbroken proof. So step back and ask the real question. Why did it work when every rule of 15th century warfare said it should not? There are 5 reasons, and they stack. Reason 1. The wagon neutralized the knight's only real weapon: momentum. A charge of heavy cavalry was a physics problem. Mass times velocity delivered on a lance point, and against formed infantry in the open, it was usually unanswerable. But a horse will not charge into a chained wall of timber, so at the wagon line, velocity went to 0, and a stationary knight was just a slow, expensive target. The Hussites did not outfight the armored nobility of Europe man for man. They built a machine that made the man-for-man fight never happen. Reason 2. Firepower density. Because the wagon was a stable, protected platform, the Hussites could concentrate crossbows and gunpowder weapons in numbers no field army had managed before, with contemporary ordnances suggesting several shooters per wagon along an unbroken front. Early handguns were inaccurate and slow, nearly useless to a man standing alone in a field, but fired in volleys from behind planking at a stalled crowd of attackers 30 paces away, accuracy stopped mattering. The wagon wall turned crude weapons into a killing zone. Reason 3. The crew system. Every wagon was a standing team of 16 to 20 men with fixed roles: gunners, crossbowmen, hook pikemen, flailmen, drivers, chainmen. And those teams drilled together, marched together, and camped together. This is, in embryo, the modern squad, and it meant a Hussite army was not a mob of individuals, but a set of interlocking components. A peasant cannot learn a knight's 40 years of horsemanship in a season. He can absolutely learn to reload a crossbow behind a plank and pass it forward, and to do his one job well under min discipline. Reason 4, and this one is genuinely ahead of its time: the written code. Around 1423, Žižka issued a military ordinance, one of the earliest formal written codes of army regulations in Europe, and its most radical clause was equality before the rules. It laid out order of march, camp discipline, division of loot into a common pool, and punishments for cowardice, theft, and desertion. And it stated explicitly that the rules bound everyone, lord, knight, townsman, and peasant alike, with no exception for rank. In an age when armies were feudal coalitions of proud noblemen who obeyed when it suited them, the Hussites fielded something closer to a professional army with a rulebook, and rulebooks win campaigns. Reason 5. The door in the trap. Because the Wagenburg was a fortress that could open, the Hussites controlled the tempo of every battle. The enemy exhausted himself against the wall on ground Žižka had personally chosen, usually a slope with anchored flanks, and only when the attacker was spent did the wagons unchain and the counterstroke come out, cavalry and flailmen hitting broken, tired men. Defense first, then annihilation. Attackers who charged the wagons were shot down, and by the end, as Domažlica showed, armies that refused to charge simply disintegrated from fear, which means the system had achieved the rarest thing in warfare: victory before contact. Which brings us to the loop I opened at the very beginning. The wagon fortress was beaten exactly once in this era, and here is the uncomfortable answer. It was beaten by Hussites. By 1434, the movement had split. The moderate Utraquists wanted a negotiated peace with the church, and the radical field armies of Tabor under Prokop the Great wanted to fight on. And on the 30th of May, 1434, near the village of Lipany, the two sides met, wagon fortress against wagon fortress. The moderate coalition, with veteran Hussite captains in command, knew perfectly well that a frontal assault on Prokop's Wagenburg was suicide, because they had spent 15 years proving it. So they did the one thing no crusader had ever had the discipline to do. They attacked, briefly, and then they faked a retreat, wagons and all, pulling back as if in disorder. And Prokop's radicals, the most experienced soldiers in Europe, made the one mistake the system could not forgive. They opened their own wagon wall and came out to pursue. The moment the fortress opened, hidden coalition cavalry swung into the gap and the flank, The pursuers were cut off from their wagons, and the machine that had shattered 5 crusades was destroyed from the inside out in an afternoon. Prokop the Great died fighting in the wagon lines. The lesson is precise, and it is the same lesson etched into every fortification in history. The wagon wall was never beaten by force. It was beaten by persuading its own soldiers to abandon it. The system's single point of failure was the door, and only men who had fought inside the system knew that. So hold the whole arc in your head for a moment. In 1420, at a drained fish pond near Sudoměř, 400 farmers with 12 turnip wagons stopped an armored cavalry force several times their size. Over the next 14 years, the system built on those wagons broke 5 international crusades, at Vítkov, at Kutná Hora and Německý Brod, at Domážlice, where an army fled from a hymn, and its blind architect, Jan Žižka, died undefeated. A record almost no commander in recorded history can match. The war ended not with the Hussites crushed, but with the church negotiating, and the compacts of Basel in the 1430s granted Bohemia religious concessions no medieval heresy had ever extracted. Which is to say, the farm wagons won not just battles, but the argument. And the ideas did not die at Lipany. Wagon fortresses spread across Eastern Europe for the next 2 centuries. The Hungarians under Jan Žižka used them against the Ottomans. And every time you hear the words pistol or howitzer, you are hearing the echo of a piszczala and a hufnica fired over a chained wagon wheel by a Bohemian farmer. 500 years later, when armored vehicles with mounted guns began punching holes through enemy lines, more than one military historian looked back at a December night outside Kutná Hora and noted that a blind man in his 60s had sketched the idea first. With oak planks, chains, and men who, a year earlier, had been threshing wheat. The knights of Europe believed war belonged to the men who could afford it. Jan Žižka proved it belonged to the men who could organize it. If this story was new to you, the like button genuinely helps more people find it. And if you want more forgotten campaigns and impossible victories examined one decision at a time, subscribe to the War Room Files. I will see you at the next battlefield.